So, as a related follow-up, since this is sort of linked to when I mentioned Professor Tirthankar Roy, the nationalist, the Indian nationalist analysis of British colonial rule sort of said that all right, there was the imposition of laissez-faire policies in the long run, but that sort of had India specialize in uh, let's say, commercial production of agrarian products, agricultural products, which weren't that high value, and that after the quote unquote deindustrialization, because there were heavy entry barriers and no native industry protection, you didn't really have capital investment of the kind that could, and the entire motley of arguments that is associated with dependency theorists. So, how do you evaluate dependency theorists, especially with respect to the global south? Because they sort of suspect this um, exaltation of laissez faire economics or the commercialism in general.
You're asking me a very complicated question, um, which really touches upon the whole question of, the colonial episode, or shall we say, or period in which Europeans, by and large Europeans, went to the what you people call the global south and colonized it, exploited it, took advantage of it, dominated it, and on and on and on. And um, and so the question is, um, what kind of effect did this have? And the answer is that, and this is basically what Roy is saying because I read his books and I know him. And basically he says, look, colonialism did some bad things and it did some good things. And weighing them one against the other is very difficult. Uh, and so, particularly, I think the example, it's not my place here to talk to a bunch of people in Delhi and tell them about their own about their own history. But the British Raj did some really awful things to India, and it did some really great things. It educated a large number of elite Indian scientists, engineers, artists, and so on and so forth. Many of them went to England and got educated there. Um, it also built infrastructure in India. It built railroads and it built harbors and it did, it set up schools. They did all that. Uh, and they destroyed the Indian cotton industry by flooding India with cheap British textiles. And so, how do you weigh these against each other? Is of course uh, it's of course very hard to know. In some countries, we actually do know. In some places, colonialism was really awful. I mean, and it's very good, very few redeeming virtues. So, for instance, you look at what the Belgians did in the Belgian Congo, or what the Dutch did in Indonesia, or certainly what the Japanese did in Korea. I mean, these are all cases of ruthless exploitation uh, with very few redeeming values. But if you look, for instance, at the French rule in West Africa, so the French, I mean, they too, they weren't choir boys and they did some awful things, but they basically, provided an education in terms of, engineering, medicine, science that would have been very difficult for these people to acquire had the French not flown them to France and taught them in French schools. And so until the present day, the languages spoken in previously colonized countries is typically the language of the colonizer. For India, for instance, which speaks 50 languages, without English, it would have been very difficult for India to function. But the same is true in Africa, in places like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, people speak English. And in Mozambique, people speak Portuguese. And in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, people speak French. And that language alone is a lubricant that makes the economy work better. So The colonial heritage is and always has been mixed. And for an economist, I think basically saying, was colonialism a good thing or a bad thing, is probably a question that we don't want to pick up. And I think Tindankar is absolutely right, sort of staying away from that. Now, the problem and this is more of an issue, I think, in economics department than it is in history department, is the ideology comes in. And in some cases, it's nationalist ideology, as what you were mentioning, and there's other cases, of course, in which that's the case. In other cases, it's much more class oriented. It's basically exploitation. Capitalism is bad. They took advantage of us. For an economist, those questions are not that particularly interesting. It's more interesting in, for instance, uh, um, you know, uh, why did this is something I've been concerned with for a long time. Why do famines disappear in India for many years? I mean, the last famines were in the late 19th century, and then you don't get another famine until 1943 with the Great Bengal famine. So in between, there's 40 years in which there are no famines in India. And good question. Why did that happen? And was it the Brits? Was it markets? Was it this? Was it that? And you basically, what's interesting there is data. And that's what people analyze, and then they process the data, they run regressions, they test things of that nature. What determines the productivity of labor? How does what happens to relative prices between agriculture and industry? There are lots of really good questions that don't require some kind of judgmental approach to history, saying this was a bad thing, this was a good thing. I mean, that's I think that is in some sense a regrettable trend. I'm interested in history not to judge people, but to understand why things are the way they are today. And I'll give you one example. There's a lot of tendency to judge people who lived in the past by calling them racist. And so there's a famous case of the great philosopher David Hume, who got cancelled at a University of Glasgow because David Hume, somewhere in his writings, made a rather nasty remark, which today would have been considered to be seriously racist, about non-white people. I forget exactly what it said, but it is pretty racist. So if somebody said this today, I would call him a racist. But in the 18th century, this was perfectly normal thinking. And things that are sexist and racist and prejudicial. And I mean, that is the way the world was. And judging it by our criteria strikes me as a complete waste of time. And so I don't do that. I mean, I don't judge people. I don't think the world really gains anything for us looking back and said, God, look at all this, anti-Muslim feelings or anti-Semitic feelings or, this, that, or the, I mean, that's, you understand that people in previous times had different values, different criteria. And so, well, fine. So once you admit that, judging them makes no sense. And I'm kind of opposed to that. And I don't think you see a lot of that in economic history. There's always some, but that's not the main thrust. But if you look at what's known as history of capitalism, that is a big part of it. And that makes the history difficult. Give you the most sensitive topic on this, and I'm not going to get into that, but the most sensitive topic about this is American slavery. So the United States, we know, of course, everybody knows, until 1865, there were slaves in the South who ate that. Okay. We all know that, and so some of the historiography basically is all very indignant, and every second sentence they need to use some negative adjective in order to condemn it. And then, many years ago, two people called Vogel and Engerman, I don't know if you know their work, but Vogel and Engerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross, in which they said, well, yeah, we agree that slavery is a bad thing, but let's take a closer look at it and see whether it was bad or good. And one of the things that they argued, which is what an economist would do, is that, of course, slaves were unfree and they had been, and they had certain limitations on what they could do. They couldn't leave their owner, they couldn't get married, da, da, da. But were they starved, for instance? Did they get enough to eat? And Bob and Stan basically said, look, I mean, these people were assets. They were like, and so if you have a car or if you have a tractor or something like that, you're going to make sure that that tractor has enough gas to do its work, and you're going to lubricate, the system, and you're going to maintain it. And you would do the same thing to a slave, not because you're inherently good or bad, but because you invested money in this thing and you want it to perform for you. Now that's, I think, a reasonable approach, but people really took offense, and until the present day, the argument that slave owners did not systematically mistreat their slaves, starve them and beat them, and I mean, it doesn't make sense. That's what Vogel and Engerman argue. It doesn't make sense for you to beat your slaves to half to death because you're throwing away money. And so this has nothing to do with being good or bad, just being reasonable. And I think that's the kind of debate that economists can have. And historians get often very disturbed about that. There was just a case last year in Florida. I don't know how much of this penetrated to the Indian press, in which they were working on the curriculum in history in Florida, and some historian had pointed out that one of the things that the slave owners did is that when they saw a slave who was particularly, adept and dexterous, they would train that slave to become a carpenter or a blacksmith or some useful occupation, because that way the slave could make more money for them. But then when the slaves were emancipated in 1865, the people who had been trained as carpenter could actually exercise their trade because they had the skills. That sounds a fairly reasonable proposition to make, and it has some historical beef. It was actually written, as it turns out, by a historian who was himself black, but that's beside the point. But then there was this storm of indignation saying, how can you say that slave owners treated their slaves, well, they didn't treat them well in every dimension because they had enslaved them and they deprived them of their freedom and so on and so forth. But in certain aspects, okay, what makes sense for the slave owner resulted in this kind of behavior. And, saying it didn't happen or it's criminal to even say so strikes me as counterproductive.